Lack of confidence is what holds you back from becoming a good speaker. In fact, you might be one of those that fear public speaking more than death. But here's the thing. Mastering public speaking is critical to unlocking growth in your career and business. Today, we've got a public speaking expert and coach who's here to share how you can go from hiding out to standing out. Whether on stage, on camera, or in any conversation, this is how to master public speaking and get results 5 times faster. Welcome, Nausheen.
Thank you so much for having me here, Michael and Art. I am so excited for this conversation.
Likewise.
Longtime fans is the best way we could say it. You know, your content and stuff you put out there is amazing. I again found myself down the rabbit hole, and you just got so many great nuggets. So I think people are going to get so much out of today's episode. So with that, you've coached over 300 executives and founders and are a 3x TEDx speaker, which is pretty amazing and speaks to your own ability to command a stage. Have you always felt confident on stage?
Confidence is such an interesting term. And the more I study it, the more I peel back the layers, I realize that everyone has their own definition of what confidence means. So if you look at it from the point of view of performance, I've been comfortable speaking in front of people from a very young age. I was one of those annoying kids who would get up in front of the entire family and recite the most boring poem ever. And from that annoying kid who loved attention, who loved it when the spotlight was on her and she felt cherished and heard and valued, that's the child that then grew up to do a radio show, seek out every single stage I could find. It was very much my first love in a lot of ways. One of those first loves that you take for granted because I never really thought of it as something that could be my calling in life. But I've loved being on stage and then later on in my life being on camera any chance that I can get. But that said, was I always good? Of course not. I was really strange or awkward in the beginning. I would have weird body language. My heart would start beating faster. I would feel like my words are coming out at 200 words per minute. So if you look at confidence from the point of view of having that inner self-belief that you can own the stage, that you can command attention, that you have the audience's attention and you deserve it, I was lacking that inner confidence for the longest time. But I had the outer confidence down. Yes, I always felt at ease and comfortable on a stage, but of course, I wasn't always good. That's something that I learned along the way, first unintentionally and then very much intentionally.
That makes a lot of sense. When you were a kid, did your parents foster that, or were they instead kind of more like, easy, come, we don't need to hear that last, recital or poem or what have you?
I was an only adopted child. So yes, I was absolutely encouraged. Very often I would be the prize pony, just kind of being shown around to people. That, of course, had a negative impact as well. It wasn't all roses and rainbows because from a very young age, I craved external validation. And that fed into low self-esteem issues because I always needed that external validation to show me that I was worthy, that I deserved what I was getting, that I could even aim for more. So if someone said I was doing everything right, then I felt like I was doing everything right. But that stopped me from actually achieving more of my potential till much later in life. But yes, to answer your question earlier, for sure, the idea of rising to the occasion, being able to entertain an audience, that was always encouraged.
Wow. So actually to double click a little bit into that and how you then got to the point of where you are today and where you helped so many hundreds of people, what happened? Like, what was that transition as you moved into, today's version of you versus the one before that, as you said, you did it, but maybe you didn't do it well?
I was a filmmaker. I was in my late 30s a few years ago. And as I approached 40, I told myself, Nausheen, it's now or never. Whatever it is that you want to do with your life. And at that time, it was finding my calling. And that had been something that I just hadn't been able to figure out for decades. So if that's what you want to do, Nausheen, if you want to figure out your calling in life, it's now or never, you better figure it out. I had that talk with myself at that time in 2022 and didn't know what it was that I had to change about my life, but I knew that I didn't want to be a filmmaker anymore. Like I was telling you guys a little bit earlier, that was never the plan. I had just stumbled into filmmaking and I had ended up creating this company, being an entrepreneur for the first time. And I was 7 years into it and I loved some aspects of it, but I did not identify as a filmmaker. So took a good hard look at my life and realized that the one thing that had been constant throughout career changes, throughout moving across the world, changing schools, changing jobs, changing everything, the one thing that hadn't changed was my love for being on stage and my love for being on camera. So I looked at what was giving me a lot of satisfaction in the filmmaking world at the time, and I realized the one thing that I loved was helping folks speak on camera in a more natural way, because I was working with all these CEOs who were speaking on camera for the first time, and they were fine with their teams. They seemed to be great as leaders, but the moment you put them in front of a camera, they would lose all sense of personality. They would just become these pale, robotic imitations of themselves, and I found that a great disservice to who they are, to all the expertise that they've actually developed, and they weren't speaking the way that they needed to establish that thought leadership. So I took my passion for the love that I had for being on stage and on camera, and then I took all this experience that I had gained through filmmaking, put the two together, and realized that the one thing that I had in common, beyond just my own love for public speaking, was sharing it with others and helping people that didn't feel about it this way get to a point where they didn't think that doing that presentation, doing that webinar, doing that podcast is a scary thing anymore.
Fascinating how life sometimes, presents things to you that you would never have figured it out unless you leaned into it and tried new things. I've always been fascinated by that.
Or that previous step
So true.
four is what, built on. You were able to build on that, then became that. As you mentioned with the CEOs, I'm curious, couple of things. One is like, what are 3 mistakes that you see a lot of these, whether it's CEO or any client for that matter, but we'll say CEO if that helps the folks a little bit more. Like, what mistakes do they generally make and how are you helping them to overcome those?
There are actually 2 big mistakes. I don't need to even to go to a third one. There are two big mistakes that I see them make. One is that they treat the idea of public speaking as something that only happens once in a while when you're behind this podium and addressing this room full of people. That's when you're public speaking. What they don't realize is that every single time they speak to their team, every single time they're on camera, every single time that they might be doing a live event of any kind, that's public speaking. And so beyond the corporate world, if you look at the entrepreneurial world, this is public speaking. We're going to be speaking to an audience that's going to be watching this later on. It's a one-to-many communication. Anytime that you do a webinar or a LinkedIn Live, that's public speaking. So why is that a mistake to not have a wider or broader definition of public speaking? It's a mistake because then you're not really practicing your communication skills. You're not aiming to become the best communicator you possibly can, regardless of the platform, the room, the environment that you're in. So that's the first big mistake. And that's what leads people to have these panic attacks right before they need to go on stage or a week before when they've been booked for a keynote or they know that they need to do a webinar to sell their course and they start having these panic attacks because they feel like these are these alien skills that they just haven't developed because they haven't been intentional. And then the other big mistake that I see everyone making is, this is before they start intentionally working on their speaking skills, most people speak on autopilot. We've developed very specific ways of communicating over the length of our adult lives, and some of those ways may not be very effective, but very rarely do people take a step back and look at how they have learned to communicate. And this blows my mind because as human beings, one of the fundamental things we do is think and communicate. And yet we don't spend time developing the skill of communication. So speaking on autopilot, letting the filler words like oh and like creep in, not bringing high energy, not bringing enough presence to the conversation, not even figuring out how you're going to use your hands, either being too distracting or not using your hands at all. All of those are symptoms of speaking on autopilot. And once people realize that they can speak in a more intentional way and change some of the habits that are stopping them from being effective as speakers, then they realize there's no limit to how good a communicator you can be, the kind of impact you can have every single time you speak.
I love that, especially, again, as you mentioned, on just that impact. And I think that's the big key component of it when it comes to especially CEOs or anybody, I guess, for that matter. But I'm curious, how important do you think it is for CEOs to be able to be good at, I guess you could say the public presentation side of things?
It's vital, because if you're not able to show your personality, your ideas, your conviction, your vision, if you're not able to communicate that internally with your team, your board, other folks that are stakeholders and decision makers, if you can't communicate internally, you're going to have a mutiny on your hands. You're going to have folks who look at you as an ineffective leader. It's not about being dictatorial or being authoritative. It's about having your finger on the pulse of your company, of your team. And the way to do it is to understand how to communicate, how to listen, how to get your ideas across. And then you look at it in a broader sense to the external world. If a CEO or a founder or an entrepreneur can't figure out how to communicate their company vision, their values, who they are, what they stand for, how they help people, if you can't communicate that to a broader audience, you are putting a limit on your own growth. You're telling yourself, we can grow this much, we can do this and this, but we can never ever grow by establishing a reputation for the founder. We can never ever grow by getting trust from people based on how they feel about this public face. So you're gonna hit that ceiling, because now we know more than ever that people trust people. People buy from people, regardless of whether you're doing B2B or B2C work. So if you're not there establishing yourself as this presence, this very human presence that can be trusted, that is credible, that has authority, then you're pretty much restricting your own growth.
How much, and maybe this would be, I don't know, maybe you'll tell me, how dare you compare it to this? Or maybe you'll say, yeah, this is about right. But sales, what you just conveyed in many ways is the ability of one to sell their ideas or sell themselves. Is that a fair way to look at it, or am I stretching it a bit there?
No, absolutely. Communication is being able to sell anything, your ideas, yourself, things that you want to advocate for. All good communication is either persuasive or clarifying, and both those things can lead to actual sales, but also the spread of ideas.
Because I think there, it's like for people to embrace the idea that, a lot of people are like, I'm not sales, I'm not that. But it's like each of us need to have this level of that we bring. And if not, you as the product is only going to go so far, because people won't have that proper communication around what it is that you either expect or want to accomplish. And I think when you said internally, I think that's so important, because when people think about these leaders, they often think about what they see externally, but that is happening so much internally. And I know Art and I have worked for leaders in the past. Who knows? We may have been those leaders at one point in our own careers too, where if you can't articulate a solid vision and direction for the team to, set them off on what they're going to accomplish on their own, then it's going to be really difficult to build out a successful, I think, team in general. People can get by, but it's not going to be the longevity that you'd be hoping for. So love that you said that.
I want to go back to the autopilot comment you made. And Michael said, we spent a lot of time with very senior leaders at Disney and Michael Disney and Netflix. And when you spend a lot of time with these senior leaders, you start to notice their autopilot tendencies. And, some of them constantly use the filler words like, or some of them are stumbling. Some, they're very charismatic and they use jokes and autopilot to kind of, like, you knew what's coming after we see it. Like, this is what's going to happen. How does someone break that habit if they've been doing that for 20, 30 years?
The very first step is realizing that you do need to break that habit. That realization is the trigger for the habit change. And yes, sometimes that comes through a nasty reality check of some kind. So I've had folks that have come to me after doing one podcast and they watched themselves back and they were in shock and trauma because they realized that, wow, that's how I come across on camera? That's awful. That's not me. That's not the impressive, influential authority that I want to see on a screen. Some people get a rude awakening in the form of their bosses, or in one of my ex-clients' cases, an investor, a board member coming to them and saying, hey, I have to be honest here. I don't find your presence and the way that you communicate in these meetings to be that of a leader. And you need to step up. You need to be more authoritative. You need to come across as being more clear, being more sure of your ideas. You need to learn how to advocate for yourself. So in one way or the other, you need to have a realization, sometimes a rude awakening, which triggers that conviction that now things need to change. And the reason why I start with that is because it's hard. Habit change is super hard, especially changing communication habits, because we only communicate every single day of our lives, which means that however old you are, that's how many years you've had of conditioning in terms of how you show up and how you speak. So, of course, it's very hard. The second step is to figure out what you want to change. What are the mannerisms that you might have picked up? Like, for example, saying like every 2 seconds, or adding a, or does that make sense at the end of every sentence? The only way to do that is to watch yourself back and to figure out what are the things that you're doing subconsciously without really being intentional that could be distracting from your message or decreasing the efficiency, the efficacy of the message in some way. And then making sure that you have a strategy in place. And that's where a coach's work would come in, for example, where you can work with a coach who would give you feedback, figure out different ways, give you different tools in terms of guiding you towards those very specific goals, whether it's to decrease filler words, to stop rambling, to gain more control over the speed at which you speak, or to just become a more charismatic presence on stage or on camera.
You said a couple of things there that want to unpack, because I love what you had said about, I'm like, which one do I want to pick first? When you talk about filler words, which might have just done right there, how does somebody stop from doing those? When I've watched when we created shorts from this, some of my shorts, I'll go through and I'll be like, dang, and actually they have tools to help people remove those. Now, I think with the idea that we'll just help these humans out and make them look better afterwards. But how do you coach people around those filler words? Like, every time, should they send a shock through their body? And there's an old watch I know that you can do. You push down on it, it'll shock you. Like
collars, the shock dot.
Yeah, the shock collars. Like, how do you?
Oh, God.
Your techniques are much better than ours. Yeah.
We're kidding right now, but it's actually similar. So the idea is first to create awareness of when you're using the filler words, because most people use them without realizing that they're using them. So the idea is first to just become more and more aware, more and more mindful. You're not going to be able to stop yourself from using them right away. So in that first phase, there's going to be many times where you say the filler word, you say and then you tell yourself, why did I just say But you won't be able to stop yourself because you've created that habit for yourself already. So first step, just becoming more aware. Second step, pausing instead of using the filler word. So literally stopping it from escaping your mouth. The principle at work here is that when we're in a hurry to speak, but our brain needs that extra split second to think of the next thing to say, our mouth is under pressure. So the mouth just says whatever the brain can feed it on autopilot. And these little phrases, these pet phrases that we have, words or pet phrases, become that default response that you can very quickly say. It doesn't mean anything. Half the time I say or there's absolutely no reason to say that. You can pause instead. So phase 2 is all about catching them before they escape your mouth and pausing. This can also be a little awkward because in this stage, you will find yourself pausing more than usual, and you'll find that your speech is a little more broken up. It's not as fluid, because something that a lot of people do to make their speech more fluid is to add in the ums and the oh so that they never actually stop talking. But now you'll have to get used to the pauses. The awkward stage doesn't last forever. There is light at the end of the tunnel. So phase 3 of this is when you can be as fluid as you were before with fewer pauses. So you'll the tendency to actually wanting to use filler words, a tendency of let me just say the or the or the like, that will go down to the point where you can absolutely almost eliminate filler words from your vocabulary.
It's very interesting. I'll admit again, when editing out any of these shorts, Arten's good at having the gaps. For me then, though, I'm still like, I still have to edit out the gaps. Whereas for me, it's more of the ums and uhs at times. And so either way, from an editing perspective, neither is always great when you're trying to tighten something up. But I do get the idea of, I just did it then. See, now I'm going to be super sensitive to it all because we're talking. You said something else too about, if I get the words right, does that make sense? Again, I'm guilty of saying that, but I will often say it when I feel like the person I'm speaking to didn't respond back in a way that let me know that, like nodding right now, like you were doing. So if I'm not getting it back, then I may say, does that make sense? Are you suggesting to just keep rolling as if, the confidence is there that they know what it is and they will ask if they have questions? Or do you think there's some give and take in that one?
The idea is great. Checking in with your audience to make sure that they're with you, that's absolutely something I recommend 100%. Every single time you speak, it cannot be a one-way conversation because no one, not even one of us, liked sitting in those boring auditoriums at school and just having our teachers drone on and on and on as if we didn't even matter. So checking in with your audience actually makes them feel like, wow, okay, so this person actually cares whether or not I'm with them. So absolutely great idea. The execution, the reason why I advise against using does that make sense, those particular words, is because it's casting doubt on whether you are sure about making sense. So instead of saying that, you can use a number of different options. For example, any questions? And if the person looks particularly confused, you can even say, I sense that things might not be very clear for you. Tell me what's going on. Or are you with me? Or was that clear? Any of those things can be, any of those options can be used. Anything that shows that you're very clear on the fact that you made sense, but you're interested in knowing whether the other person's with you or if they have any confusions or any questions.
I've found that, and maybe it's just obvious to me and not to the others, but I found maybe some certain senior leader people use that word, does that make sense, as a form of influence. Because if you're asked, does that make sense? To say no is not something that person will respond with, because that says, I'm dumb. Like that's probably what somebody might think. So by using, does that make sense, is putting pressure on the person to say yes. And all of a sudden it can come across as you just sold an idea to somebody and they've agreed to something. And every time that's happened, I'm like, I cringe. I'm like, please don't say yes. Please don't say yes. But then all the time that the folks say yes. And then I have to kind of, in the background, make sure, are you sure you understood what just happened? If you said yes to this is XYZ result. Oh no, that's not what I thought. So I'm very cautious of that phrase.
It is interesting. I think it kind of depends on who it's coming from, based on what you just described versus if it's somebody more junior, even in some ways, or however you want to approach that. Because I would say something like that, just like sorry, there's a lot of people, and I've been one of those people who constantly apologize, even when it's like not your fault per se. It's just their default. And that can also come across as lower confidence, or probably some other ways that you could put that. But what are your thoughts on sorry and people who apologize maybe too much?
Yeah, absolutely. You're not exactly coming across as someone who is very sure of themselves, confident of themselves. And it's great that Art brought up the second idea of people actually using this phrase, using that, does that make sense, in a more insidious way. And I would still say that even in that case, that person's not a good communicator. Because if you could see right through it, and B, if you're using anything to squash problems, to
evil, not good,
sweep them under the rug, that's not really being a good communicator, because at some point those problems are going to rise again. It's not that you can just force people to do things anymore, thankfully, in most parts of the world. So if someone really isn't sold on something, they'll do it because the boss said so, but are they going to put like 110% into it? Are you setting them up for success? Possibly not.
So I'm curious, and on the topic of confidence, something that lots of people struggle with, whether presenting or what in life, it's just one of those things that people often doubt themselves. If somebody was preparing, we'll just say, for that conversation, even with their team, let's say, dang it, filler word. You got me thinking about them all the time now. This is good. Any of our listeners are like, thank goodness, finally somebody's got them thinking about these. But what tips would you give for an individual that are preparing, that are having that question about their overall abilities, and how can they build that confidence?
Right. So first, I would have them look at what is the root cause of that lack of confidence, and what really is that lack of confidence. Because after having worked with people who come from different kinds of backgrounds and have different levels of stage fear, I've realized that it's very much a spectrum. You have folks that are so incredibly shy on stage, so who have such huge mental blocks that they're frozen on camera, or they've run off stages. I've worked with folks like that who have that trauma, and they really feel physically and mentally incapable of going up on stage or going on camera and being themselves. And then on the other end, you also have folks that don't feel that level of stage fright, but they still feel nervous, and that comes out in the form of speaking too fast, rambling, perhaps sweating, needing a few minutes to really settle into whatever it is they're doing, whatever it is that they're speaking about. So understanding where you really are in terms of your stage fright and figuring out what it's stemming from. Is it a fear of judgment, a fear of, oh my God, this piece of media is going to be out there forever, and if I look terrible, I'm going to look terrible forever? Is it fear of people disagreeing with you? Is it the imposter syndrome? And then figure out how you can tackle that by creating what I call a positive feedback loop, which is you make an intentional effort to challenge negative self-talk before you need to go on stage or be on camera. And of course, you make sure that you're prepared in every way possible. Do warm-ups before you go on stage. Make sure that you're telling yourself that it's the audience that needs to benefit, not you who needs to look good. You're not on American Idol where people are there to judge you. People are there to learn. If they can learn something, if someone walks away knowledge rich after you've spoken, you've done your job. So all of that happens before. Being aware and present and committing to the moment during the speaking opportunity, whatever it is, and then debriefing with yourself afterward so that you can give yourself credit for the things you did well, and so that you can use that as proof to counter the negative self-talk the next time. So creating that positive feedback loop very intentionally absolutely helps counter the nerves and that stage fright.
And then I think to that point, you got to stack that win for next time, which then hopefully helps to build on that confidence.
Yeah. And then preparing, right? So much of nervousness stems from this feeling of not being prepared. But then it's you who doesn't give yourself time to rehearse and practice before the presentation. It's very often that person who's working on their slides till the last possible minute that feels that those nerves, because then they feel like, okay, I made the slides, but gosh, what happens after the slide? Oh, okay, okay. And then they just start reading the slides.
Yeah, Art and I, we had that opportunity to work with somebody when we were at Disney who was just brilliant up in front of people, like to this point where you just assume they just woke up that way. But then when we got to see his process and how much work went into it, how much practice, how much preparing specifically for that type of audience, back to what you said, thinking about it of how you can benefit them versus how you're being judged. And it was incredible because you then had so much more respect because you're like, oh, it just goes in natural, because that's the only part people see most of the time is that person who's now up on stage doing brilliant. They don't see that they put in a week plus worth of effort making sure that they could show off in that way. In fact, for you, because you've done some of these TED Talks, I got to assume that there's probably a lot of preparation that you're putting into those. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, for sure. I mean, Steve Jobs put hours and days and weeks into preparing for all the talks that he did right up till the end. And that preparation piece that you're talking about is so essential to not just, of course, having a seamless presentation, but also to your own sense of preparedness, to your own sense of whatever happens, whatever goes wrong, I can handle it because I know this content inside out. I can recite it in my sleep. So yes, that was one of the criteria I had for myself for my first TEDx talk. I told myself I should be able to say this in my sleep. I should be able to say it backwards. I should be able to pick up a single sentence from the middle of the talk and carry it till the end.
I love it. No, and again, having watched a few of those, you do a very good job with that. And you talk about something else too in one of your videos I came across. Blasted ums. Now I can't stop. Okay. This is for anybody out there listening out there.
I'm so sorry, Michael.
No, it's actually a good thing. You're who I probably needed in my life to, really think about this stuff more. In fact, actually, when you were saying before the idea of, somebody's boss maybe giving that feedback or whatever it is at times, it's like, well, you need to, like, bosses will say, be more authentic, or they might say, you need to focus on your executive presence, all these things. But that challenge a lot of people have is they walk away from there with this whole sense of, okay, great, thanks. But there's not actually a whole lot of direction. And that's what I love about this conversation. And obviously what you do for your clients is that's where people get this extra level of, call it sensitivity, because they're going in and now they're being asked to focus and think about that, because that's what happens. You hear that at the end of something. Sometimes it hurts enough that you're like, okay, I'm not going to do that again. But for the most part, unless you get that regular feedback on a regular basis, or somebody over there is looking and thinking, I heard that, it's hard to stay focused on it. And therefore, that feedback doesn't come again for another 4 months. And you're like, oh, well, I thought I had made a difference because nobody told me anything otherwise. So I love it, even though it's, no, it's not painful, I was going to say. To the question, though, you had mentioned...
It is, though.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that's with anything. It's kind of like, I always take it back to like working out. It's like, it's going to burn, when you first do it, but then you get the results that come from that. So for Steve Jobs, who you mentioned, I know he takes the approach. It's just when I say Steve Jobs, maybe I just did it again, people. Okay, so now anybody's going to be able to listen to me all the time. Be like, there's another, Michael. There's another. Those will be all of our comments from now on. You did it 4 times. Maybe I
should ask the audience.
34 times. That's our question for our audience. How many did you count? We'll take that interaction. So you mentioned musicality before when you look at somebody like Martin Luther King. And Arten and I had the chance when we went to, it was Duarte, they teach about presentation. And one of the things that they had also mentioned there is like Steve Jobs, he uses a painting of a picture that's, if this, then that, or it's the I have a dream speech in general is a lot of the visualizing of what today is and then painting that picture of what tomorrow can be. But you go into the musicality, and we had a guest on here too that you also know, Yasmin, who talks about his background being a rapper and how that's actually helped him in his writing style because it almost like hitting beats and such for him. So could you explain a little bit more about what musicality is when people approach, either public speaking or any sort of level of presentation?
It's about understanding your voice in a lot of detail, figuring out what is it that you can do with your voice to capture attention and then to sustain attention. So if you go deeper into all the different things that you could do as a speaker with your voice, you're looking at what I call the 5P framework, where you're looking at your pacing, how fast you're speaking, do you have control over it? You could go a little bit faster if you want to show excitement or intensity, or you can go slower to talk about something that has drama, something that you're emphasizing. So the speed at which you speak, the pauses that you take, are you making sure that people are digesting what you're saying? That brings in musicality, because if you're just telling people idea 1, then idea 2, then idea 3, then idea 4, then idea 5, they're going to forget about idea 1 by the time you get to idea 5 if you don't have pauses in the middle. Pauses help people engage with you in those little moments of silence.
When people do think about Steve Jobs on stage, or even like Art and I were talking about this before, like, people have favorite speakers. Who are they? And I think that's hard sometimes for a lot of people to pick because they don't spend maybe loads of time studying that aspect. But I think if you do, the Jobs, the Martin Luther Kings, Barack Obama was great at the way that he enunciated and spoke about things there. Do you have any particular favorite speakers that you like to look towards and learn from?
I look at what tools the speakers are using. That's more fascinating for me instead of just looking at one specific speaker. So I love all the folks that you mentioned. Those are great, great case studies to start from, to look at what is it that these speakers are doing well. That's the first thing that I also tell my clients to do, to stop being just passive consumers of content or of videos or of talks and really peel back the curtain. So Simon Sinek is someone who does speaking really well. And what's really remarkable about him is that he brings his quiet personality to the way that he speaks. He doesn't feel compelled to exude Tony Robbins levels of energy, but he still gets attention. He still commands an audience. How does he do that? Well, he's playing with his voice. He's using body language. He's articulating, enunciating, like you mentioned for Obama. Again, great case study. Both these gentlemen, by the way, Obama and Simon Sinek, if you watch one of their interviews, they use a lot of filler words. So I actually get questions from people sometimes saying, well, all of you speaking coaches are so against filler words, and yet you have the ex-president of the United States using all these filler words, and someone that people actually respected and looked up to. So the point is, if you can figure out how to tap into that inner confidence that we talked about earlier, and if you understand what shows that outer confidence, how you can use your body language, how you can enunciate, how you can organize your thoughts, then a filler word once in a while is not going to take away from the message. Then you don't need to try to be someone else, an extroverted personality, when you're actually quiet, and that's your power. So the one thing that unites all these speakers is the comfort that they feel, the level of control that they feel anytime that they speak. That's really what it's about. Becoming a stronger speaker is about knowing that you have control over everything in terms of communicating when you have that spotlight.
And what you just said there, too, is a big difference I see with some of the people you just mentioned, as well as people I've seen in the past. They command the stage. They walk around. They're okay with that silence. It's not even about what they're saying. It's actually now just about the anticipation that they might be building or something else, around that topic. So I think that is important. And it tells people, too, it's okay to take that pause. In fact, sometimes it might be because you're reestablishing your bearings, but not everybody else out there knows it. And it's the same thing, I think, when, you have that eye contact with people, even though I admit I had somebody once tell me, they're like, it's like you were staring into my, so I thought you were talking directly to me. I'm like, I did not even see you because, was doing that attempt of like, I'm just going to keep wandering, my eyes around. But it's so interesting how the audience tells their own story. I think it's the same thing a lot, too, when people do fail, back to what you said around people having that fear that they may, completely bomb. Well, as soon as you do, and I forget, there was a TED Talk on this too, but as soon as you do, usually what happens is people start rooting for you. So you don't lose them. Instead, you actually gain them even more because now they want to see you succeed. And that's something I've had to tell myself at times because when you are afraid of that, that's what happens. But I think, again, back to the preparation side, you said that really is ultimately what's going to help to win the game.
And people are rooting for you, not just because they're good human beings. I mean, I would love to believe that, and I do have hope for humanity. But people are rooting for you because if you do well, they would have made good use of their time. They're investing their time by listening to your podcast, by being present in your presentation. So if you're doing well, they can walk away knowledge rich. Why wouldn't they want that? So of course they're rooting for you.
So let's say you do get a heckler. How do you approach that?
Gosh, I would say that in 17 years of being on radio, being on many, many, many stages, including TEDx 3 times, and being on camera, I haven't gotten heckled a lot, despite doing improv and stand-up on stage. So I'm saying this because for anyone listening, if you have this fear of being heckled, do know that it's very rare. And yes, it does happen more in settings where there is either hostility, or if you're just unfortunate enough to do an open mic set with a crowd that's drunk and just feeling not very entertained.
Or if you're a politician, maybe.
Well, that's right. President.
If you're a politician, for sure. If you have a sensitive, hostile environment, right? If there is any kind of hostility, but in most cases, there isn't going to be hostility. So how would I manage the situation if I was heckled? I would aim to ignore it a few times as much as I can, because I treat them in the same way that I would treat a troll, where if you feed the troll with attention, they will come back. But if you ignore the troll, then most likely they're going to go away. But of course, if the person becomes disruptive, then I would stop the presentation and either address the person or ask for help from an organizer.
Got it. I think there was an example probably in your YouTube channel as well, or it might have been Instagram, with Obama and how he handled, that. Because again, politics, just like, Artin has said, and it is so interesting, can become a bit deflective, but sometimes it's also just that kind of smiling at it and just being like, you might be right, or whatever it is, like that just diffuses it, because now you can move on from where it was at.
Nausheen, I have a question for you. Now, whether you like him or not, this person has rabid fans. Would you consider Elon Musk a good speaker?
Yes and no. So he's a great speaker in the sense of not being silent. A lot of people that I work with have just been silent for so long, and that's not doing them any favors at all. So the fact that Elon, as a personality, isn't afraid to go out and speak, that in itself makes him a communicator. At least I can give him credit for not letting the fear stop him. Sure, he feels fear. He feels the nerves just like everyone else. But he's always been very open about his opinions, and that shows a certain level of confidence and self-assurance, which is great in a speaker. There are times where he lets hostility get to him. So I also did a review of that when he had an interview and the interviewer was constantly being hostile towards him, and he didn't diffuse the situation. He didn't come out on top because he wasn't controlling the narrative. So all of that brings me back to that point about how you as a speaker are always in control. Even when there are circumstances beyond your control, the way that you respond to something doesn't need to be your immediate reaction. So any great communicator understands that. All the great CEOs that have gone through controversial times and have had to go out to the media and to the press, the ones that we remember and respect the most have been the ones that have A, communicated, that haven't just gone in and said no comment, and B, who have aimed to be as calm as possible, have aimed to diffuse the situation as much as possible, and have aimed to be as transparent as possible. Those are the people that we respect in times like that.
So true. Well, I have to compliment you on your own charisma, which maybe in the future we could dive more into that. But you have just this natural presence about you, which is where I'm sure, you've practiced over time, and I can see a lot of value you'd be able to bring to people. But also watching your body language, the pauses, everything that you had mentioned there, you were putting into practice. So for those who either are at a point in their business where they know they can get better at it, or for the employees out there who have got that feedback that might feel a little bit empty and really want to get better at this, probably because they got big things in their future they want to get to. How can they reach you?
For sure. So speaking.coach is my website. That's where you can get a lot of free resources, including a free course on how to speak fearlessly, which has all those core components of the speaker's toolkit that I was talking about earlier, where you learn more about your voice, your energy, your body language. So speaking.coach, that's where you'll find a lot of these free resources, and you'll also find a way to get in touch with me.
Awesome. And then socials, are you on a few socials that people should be aware of? Or is that where they should find it too?
Yes, LinkedIn is my platform. So if you look up Nausheen I Chen on LinkedIn, I believe I'm the only one. Should be fairly easy to find. Look out for the girl with the purple hair, the purple background, the purple videos.
Awesome. Well, it was a pleasure having you. I will count back my ums. You both win for having less. I could guarantee that. Really super insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for spending time with us, Nausheen. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
Oh, and by the way, we will link below some of her. She's got some really great content, as I mentioned. Her one about smiles, definitely look at. I got a kick out of watching that one, and I've seen those smiles before. And people who don't know it, it's just a little teaser. Take a look at it. We'll link it below. So take care.